Turn the lights down and get comfortable. Tonight's story begins in the dark. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what kind of stories keep you up at night.
I was never supposed to be a ranger in the deep zones. I didn't have the seniority, didn't have the political insulation, didn't have the kind of family that makes paperwork disappear when something goes wrong. I was assigned to trail maintenance and wildlife observation, the safe work, the kind where the worst thing you deal with is a lost hiker or a bear that's learned how to open coolers. That changed the day I found the symbols. I'm recording this now because they told me not to write it down, not to draw it, not to say the shapes out loud, and because they already know where I am. If this gets uploaded, it's because they decided it was harmless or because they want someone else to listen. The first symbol was carved into a lodgepole pine less than a mile from the access road, too clean to be weather damage, too deep to be vandalism. It wasn't a word, it wasn't a picture, it was a sequence of cuts that made my eyes slide away when I tried to focus on them, like my brain didn't want to hold the shape. My radio crackled the moment I stood near it, not static, not interference, but a soft, rhythmic clicking, like someone tapping a fingernail on plastic. Dispatch said my signal was fine. GPS showed me drifting 50 feet east, then snapping back. I took photos. That was my mistake. 2 hours later, before I even made it back to the truck, a voice came through my radio using my call sign in the exact cadence my father used when he taught me how to fish as a kid. My father has been dead for 9 years. I didn't answer. That part of the training stuck. The thing wearing his voice followed me anyway. I never saw it directly. That's important. People expect claws, eyes, teeth. What I saw was absence, places where the forest felt staged, like a movie set after the actors leave. Footprints that began as elk and ended as bare human heels, a smell like wet copper. When I reached the truck, there was a man waiting who already knew my name, my file number, and the exact time I'd taken the photos. He smiled like a coworker. He said the word "thank you" like it was a test. He told me the carvings were warnings, not messages, and that the people who made them didn't believe in killing what lived out here, only in naming where it was allowed to exist. He said I was being reassigned because I'd seen something and hadn't tried to explain it away. Before he left, he leaned close and told me Rule 1, never repeat the shapes even from memory. Rule 2, if you hear a familiar voice on the radio after dusk, mark the time and keep moving. Rule 3, if the trees are marked in a spiral, turn back because something else already knows you're coming. I asked him what it was. He said, "Which one?" Then my radio clicked again, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world.
They flew me out the next morning in a helicopter with no markings and a crew that didn't introduce themselves. No paperwork, no signatures, just a verbal acknowledgement recorded on a handheld device that was immediately sealed in a bag when I finished speaking. They didn't ask me what I'd seen, they told me what I hadn't. They said there was no creature, no entity, no anomaly, only an unregulated presence with adaptive mimicry. They said words like habitat drift and cultural interference and legacy survivorship. And every time I tried to interrupt, the woman across from me smiled like a therapist and nodded as if I'd already agreed. She called herself my handler, said it jokingly, like an inside joke I wasn't in on yet. She told me my reassignment wasn't optional because people who see the signs either leave the service, disappear, or get recruited. "You didn't disappear," she said. "That says something good about you." The facility wasn't underground like the movies. It was worse. It was a converted ranger station in a town so small it didn't show up on most maps. The kind of place where everyone waves and nobody asks questions because they already know the answers. They trained me there for 6 weeks. Not weapons, not tactics. Rules. Old ones, new ones. Ones that contradicted each other depending on which thing you were dealing with. They never used the same name twice. Sometimes they said the forest was sick. Sometimes they said it was correcting itself. Once, when they thought I was asleep, I heard them argue about whether the first presence learned to wear people or whether it had always been able to. That was the first time I heard the other word whispered, the one they didn't like saying indoors, the one that made the lights hum when it came up. They warned me that drawing the forbidden symbols caused proximity effects, that saying them out loud caused attention, and that thinking about them too hard caused dreams that weren't yours. My radio was replaced with a government-issued unit that only worked when it wanted to. GPS was downgraded on purpose. Accuracy makes it curious, my handler said, friendly as ever. On my first field assignment, I was sent to check on a backcountry cabin where a seasonal ranger hadn't reported in. No distress call, no emergency beacon, just silence. The trail markers leading in were intact. The ones leading out were gone. Inside the cabin, everything was normal, except the walls. Someone had carved over older carvings, trying to erase them, cutting deeper and deeper until the wood splintered. I recognized the spiral from Rule 3 and felt my teeth ache the way they do before a storm. I found the ranger's notebook under the bunk. The last entry wasn't words. It was an attempt to copy the symbol without looking at it directly. Lines hesitant, apologetic. My radio turned on by itself. Not a voice this time. Breathing. Too slow. Too patient. I left the cabin exactly the way I found it, because that's what they told me to do when something had already claimed a place. When I reported back, my handler congratulated me. She said most people try to rescue someone who's already been repurposed. She said I was learning. As she walked away, she added, almost casually, "The first one watches you to see if you can become useful. The second one watches to see what you'll become."
They started sending me out alone after that. Not because I was trusted, but because pairs created patterns, and patterns attracted attention. The town stayed friendly, too friendly. People remembered my name before I told it to them. The diner waitress always poured my coffee before I sat down. Never asked how the field work was going, only whether the trees had been quiet. I learned which roads not to take by the way my GPS tried to reroute me onto them anyway. The arrows spinning, the distance counter ticking backward like I was walking out of somewhere I hadn't reached yet. The symbols showed up more frequently the farther I went from paved access. Some were fresh, some so old the bark had grown around them, swallowing the cuts until only the suggestion remained. The indigenous warnings were different. Those were deliberate, clean, respected. They used space instead of repetition, a single mark every few hundred yards, like punctuation. When I asked my handler about them, she said not to photograph those at all. "Those aren't for us," she said. "Those are boundaries." Radios failed near the boundaries. Not dead, just wrong. Voices overlapped. Dispatch answered questions I hadn't asked yet. Once, I heard myself come through the speaker, giving my exact coordinates and calmly requesting extraction for injuries I didn't have. I smashed the radio against a rock until it stopped. That night, something followed my camp at a distance I could measure by the way the forest stopped making noise in a widening ring. I never saw it, but I smelled it, that copper-wet rot, stronger now, layered with pine and old smoke. In the morning, my boot prints were joined by another set that matched my stride perfectly but pressed deeper into the soil, like whatever made them weighed more or understood gravity better. The disappearances stayed off the books. A hunter who missed a check-in, a family that drove into the backcountry and never drove out, a local kid who went looking for a dog and came back alone, barefoot, eyes wrong, repeating a rule nobody had taught him. The brutal part didn't happen until week 11. I was tracking flagged movement near a watershed when I found a tree split open from the inside, sap frozen mid-drip, ribs of wood peeled outward like something had pushed through. There were symbols carved on the interior, perfect, undamaged by weather, and for a second I understood them. Not what they meant, what they did. My GPS screamed a high electronic wail, and my radio burst into voices all at once, some pleading, some laughing, one calling me by a name I'd never used. I ran. That was mistake number 2. The thing didn't chase me. It waited ahead. I came around a bend and saw a man standing in my path wearing a ranger uniform from 20 years ago, badge number scratched off, smiling with my father's mouth. Behind him, deeper in the trees, something taller shifted its weight, antlered shadow brushing the branches, patient, territorial. I remembered the rules too late. Don't acknowledge, don't negotiate, don't let either of them think you've chosen. I fired a flare between them and felt heat wash over my face as the taller shadow recoiled, offended more than hurt. When I looked back, the man was gone, but his footprints stayed, sinking into the dirt until they stopped being human. When I got back to the station, my handler was already there, coffee in hand, smiling like always. She didn't ask what happened, she just said, "Good, now it knows you can survive." And then, softer, like an apology, "That means the other one will start planning."
After the flare incident, my status changed. That's the word they used. Not promoted, not reassigned, changed. I was issued a new ID that didn't scan at normal checkpoints and a radio channel that didn't exist on the dial. My handler stopped pretending I had a choice. She started explaining things the way you explain weather to someone who's already outside. The first presence, the one that wore voices and faces, was adaptive, curious. It learned people because people were useful. The second was older, territorial, and didn't learn so much as remember. They never used the word Wendigo, never said skinwalker out loud, but the rules split cleanly along those lines. One followed roads, cabins, names. The other followed hunger, boundaries, and violations. The symbols mattered because they told the forest what rules applied in that place. Drawing them invited arbitration. Saying them invited a hearing. That's why we weren't allowed to do either. I was sent to escort a survey team near an abandoned mining town that officially burned down in the 70s. Unofficially, it had been sealed. The indigenous markers stopped a mile out. Past that, the trees were unmarked, which was worse. Radios worked fine until we crossed the old town line. Then every unit switched to the same channel without being touched. The survey lead heard his wife asking where he'd put the spare keys. Another man heard his brother crying. I heard nothing, which my handler later said was a bad sign. We found the town intact, buildings standing, dust undisturbed, like time had been told to wait. In the center square was a symbol burned into the ground so deep the soil had turned to glass. I didn't draw it, I didn't say it. I thought about it anyway, and that was enough. One of the surveyors wandered off while we were packing up. No scream, no struggle, just absence. When we searched, we found his jacket folded neatly on a porch chair and a set of footprints that began barefoot and ended wrong, toes too long, stride too even. That night, something walked the perimeter of our camp, counting our breaths out loud, in my voice. The brutal moment came just before dawn. One of the team bolted from his tent and ran toward the tree line, calling my name, saying I'd promised to help him. I tackled him before he crossed the boundary marker I'd scratched into the dirt with a stick, the closest thing to protection we had. He fought like he was drowning, screaming that it was behind him, that it was learning faster now. When the sun came up, he went quiet, eyes tracking something above the trees, and whispered a rule I'd never been taught. If it offers you a way out, it's already decided you're staying. Extraction arrived late. They always do. My handler met me at the edge of the zone and checked me for injuries that hadn't happened yet. She told me the surveyor was listed as resigned, effective immediately. She told me the town would be erased again. Before she left, she added a new rule, one she said only applies to me now. If you notice yourself being watched, even when you're alone indoors, don't tell us. That means it's no longer just observing.
That means you've become infrastructure.
I stopped going home after that. Home is a concept that relies on doors working the same way every time you open them. My handler arranged a residence for me instead, a rented cabin with government internet that lagged whenever I thought about the forest too hard. Cameras on the outside, none inside, which was how I knew they were serious. They don't watch what they're afraid of provoking. I was still sent into the field, but now there were checklists that didn't exist on paper, and debriefs where they asked questions slightly out of order to see if I'd correct them. I learned not to. Correction implies ownership of memory, and memory was what both presences fed on in different ways. The adaptive one tried to talk to me more often. It used coworkers, old friends, a woman I dated once who knew things she shouldn't have remembered. Always friendly, always reasonable. It wanted me to confirm details, to help it refine. The territorial one stayed silent, but made its displeasure known through absence. Dead zones where birds refused to land, trails that vanished overnight, a ranger truck found idling with no one inside and frost on the steering wheel in midsummer. Indigenous markers appeared ahead of my patrols now, freshly carved, as if someone was trying to keep pace with me. I never crossed those lines, not again. The handlers noticed changes before I did. My resting heart rate dropped. I slept less without feeling tired. Radios stopped malfunctioning around me and started behaving, locking on to my position like I was an anchor point. During one operation, a blackout sweep after a cluster of disappearances, my GPS stayed accurate while everyone else's drifted. My handler didn't smile that time. She asked if I'd been dreaming in symbols. I said no. That was the truth. I wasn't dreaming at all. The unforgettable moment came during a routine welfare check in a town that shouldn't have existed anymore. The people were there, friendly as ever, waving, living in houses that records said had been condemned. They all used my name. In the schoolhouse, I found a wall covered in careful drawings of the forbidden shapes, done by children who didn't look frightened, only attentive. The teacher told me they'd been having good listeners lately. When my radio clicked on, it wasn't a voice. It was silence so complete it pressed against my ears. Outside, the two presences met for the first time I could perceive, not fighting, not merging, just overlapping like shadows at different depths. I understood then what the handlers had been doing. They weren't containing anything. They were managing a boundary condition, a negotiation that required a human constant, someone who could be recognized by one and tolerated by the other, someone who knew the rules and could break them just enough to keep the balance from tipping. When I reported in, my handler finally dropped the friendly tone. She said the program would continue with or without me, but outcomes were statistically better if I stayed compliant. She said extraction was no longer guaranteed. She said monitoring would increase. As I left, she added the last thing I needed to hear. If you start to feel hungry where you shouldn't, or if people begin to recognize you in places you've never been, mark the time. That's how we'll know which one is winning. I'm recording this now because the trees outside my cabin have fresh carvings I didn't make. My radio hasn't clicked in days, and I can feel the forest paying attention in a way that feels less like observation and more like recognition. If you're listening to this, understand that the rules still work, but only while someone remembers them, and they're starting to remember me back.
They moved me closer to the line after that, closer than anyone with a pulse was supposed to be. Officially, I was assisting with environmental impact assessments. Unofficially, I was the assessment. My presence stabilized things the way sandbags stabilize a river only while they're in place. The handlers stopped pretending this was temporary. They installed sensors keyed to my biometric data, not to track me, but to track what reacted to me. When my pulse spiked, certain valleys went quiet. When I slept, Activity increased along old logging roads that hadn't existed in decades. They told me not to feel guilty about it. Guilt implies choice. The adaptive presence stopped using familiar faces and started using unfamiliar kindness. Strangers who helped too much. Rangers who offered rides I hadn't asked for. A voice on the radio that sounded like it had learned empathy from a manual. It wanted me to consent, to participate, to become a liaison. The territorial presence responded by tightening boundaries. Trees split, trails closed themselves. A fire lookout collapsed inward without burning, as if folded by a careful hand. Indigenous warnings appeared again, closer now, sometimes overnight, sometimes while I was watching the tree, the cuts appearing between blinks. I learned another rule without being told: never acknowledge the carver. On a patrol near a frozen lake, I found a camera crew van abandoned, doors open, equipment stacked neatly. No blood, no damage, just absence. My radio turned on and played back my own field notes from months earlier, words I didn't remember saying, describing a hunger that wasn't physical and a cold that felt like clarity. I shut it off and kept walking, because stopping gives them time to arrange things. The brutal moment this time wasn't violent, it was quiet. I was sent to extract a junior ranger who'd crossed a boundary marker, chasing a signal that sounded like his sister. I reached him in time to see him standing knee-deep in snow, smiling, saying it finally made sense now. He asked me if I could hear it too. I couldn't. That's how I knew he was already gone. I told him to step back. He shook his head and took one step forward instead, and the snow accepted him like water. When I reported back, the handlers marked the incident as a weather-related fatality and asked me how I felt. I told them the truth: nothing. That was when they started using the word infrastructure out loud. Infrastructure doesn't leave. It gets upgraded, rerouted, or decommissioned. They began rotating personnel around me instead of the other way around. New faces, new smiles, same knowledge. They already knew I wouldn't make it out, because out assumes a boundary that still applies. At night, I can feel the two presences adjusting to me the way animals adjust to a fence that's been there long enough to be part of the terrain. One waits for me to slip, the other waits for me to accept. My GPS no longer drifts, radios no longer lie. Children in towns that shouldn't exist draw me in the margins of their notebooks, careful, respectful, never getting the face quite right. If this confession sounds calm, it's because calm is efficient, and because somewhere between the rules and the monitoring, the forest stopped asking who I was and started deciding where to put me.
They don't send me on patrols anymore. Patrol implies enforcement. I get deployments, short notice, no objectives written down, just coordinates and a time window where things tend to go wrong if I'm not present. The handlers monitor the forest through me now, not the other way around. When I arrive somewhere, radios stabilize for a few hours. When I leave, disappearances resume in patterns they can model but not stop. They've started tracking me the way they track weather systems, assigning probability cones instead of routes. I asked my handler once what happens if I refuse. She didn't answer directly. She just showed me a graph where my absence correlated with increased fatalities and said, "We prefer not to test that again." The adaptive presence stopped pretending to be human at all. It communicates in logistics now. Moved equipment, open gates, correct paperwork filed too early. It wants access, not conversation. The territorial one has begun circling closer, its influence bleeding into towns during lean seasons, hunger rising when winters stretch too long. The symbols appear unbidden in my thoughts sometimes, not as shapes, but as instructions, and I have to ground myself by reciting the rules I'm allowed to remember. The unforgettable moment came during a controlled burn operation.
Fire is one of the few things that territorial presence respects. I was stationed at the perimeter when the smoke parted, and I saw it clearly for the first time, tall, antlered, wrong, watching the flames like a memory it didn't trust. Across the line, the adaptive presence wore a face I didn't recognize, smiling with too many practiced expressions, waiting for me to acknowledge it. For a second, they were both there, and I understood the truth the handlers never say. They're not enemies. They're checks and balances. One expands, one contains, and I'm the variable that lets the equation keep running. When the fire jumped the line, it didn't burn me. It bent around me like I was a rock in a stream. The handlers saw that on their monitors and went very quiet. Afterward, they increased surveillance again. Drones that don't show up on radar, analysts who don't sleep. My handler finally admitted what they'd been circling around for months. The program doesn't end with me leaving the forest. It ends when the forest no longer needs a human reference point. "You're becoming predictable," she said, like it was a diagnosis. "People in backcountry towns have started leaving offerings near my cabin. Food, antlers, radios that no longer work. They don't knock, they don't ask. They just leave things where I'll find them. Indigenous markers now facing me instead of away. Not warnings, not boundaries, but acknowledgments. That scares me more than anything else so far. If you're listening to this because the file went public, understand that the cover-up isn't about monsters, it's about continuity, about keeping something ancient operating within margins we can survive. I'm not a ranger anymore. I'm the thing they track to make sure the other things stay where they're supposed to. And lately, the graphs say I'm drifting." They stopped calling it drift after the first analyst quit mid-briefing and walked out into the snow without a coat. After that, the language softened. Adjustment, phase change, naturalization. My handler still met me in person, still smiled, but she stood farther away now, like distance itself was a protocol. The sensors keyed to me began flagging anomalies when I thought about places instead of when I entered them. Valleys went quiet hours before I arrived. Towns reported bad dreams when I was rerouted nearby. Once, an evacuation order was issued for a flood that never came, and the only explanation anyone could offer was that the water levels behaved as if something heavy had waded through upstream without displacing volume. I felt it too, a sense of placement, like the forest was solving for me. The adaptive presence no longer approached directly. It used intermediaries, messages left where I'd find them, equipment pre-staged with my initials written in my own handwriting. It wanted me to formalize things, to accept a role it could optimize around. The territorial presence responded by tightening winters, shortening daylight, increasing the cost of mistakes. When I crossed a boundary I shouldn't have, by accident, by necessity, I'm not sure, the trees didn't warn me. They leaned. That was new. The brutal moment this time was unavoidable. A search and rescue call came in for a missing bus carrying seasonal workers. I was deployed because the projected casualty count dropped when I was present. We found the bus intact on a logging road that hadn't existed for 50 years, engine cold, doors open. Everyone inside was gone except the driver, who sat calmly in his seat, eyes open, hands on the wheel. He told me he'd followed the correct route because the signs were familiar. When I asked him what signs, he pointed at me. The handlers reviewed the footage frame by frame. In 3 frames, my reflection in the bus window lagged behind my movement, turning its head slightly after I'd already looked away. They didn't show me that part. I saw it anyway, in my dreams, which have started again, though they don't feel like mine. Indigenous elders requested a meeting, the first direct contact since the program began. They didn't accuse, they didn't plead. They told my handler that boundaries work until something becomes a landmark, and landmarks get built around.
They asked me if I remembered my first rule. I did. Don't repeat the shapes. They nodded like that explained everything. After that, the handlers added a final protocol. If monitoring indicates convergence, if both presences respond to me at once, I'm not to be extracted. I'm to remain in place and let the situation resolve. Resolve is the word they used. Friendly, neutral, like a software update. I'm recording this now because my GPS has started labeling locations with my name, because radios in 3 counties synchronize when I speak, and because the forest has begun marking paths toward me instead of away. If you're still listening, understand this: the rules didn't fail, they evolved, and whatever I'm becoming, it isn't an accident, it's a solution.
They enacted the convergence protocol 3 days ago. I know because my handler stopped returning calls and the drones pulled back to a respectful distance, high enough that I could still hear them but not see them. Respect is a bad sign. It means the system no longer thinks proximity improves outcomes. The forest feels denser now, not physically, but administratively, like permits have been approved and everyone finally knows where they're allowed to stand. Both presences react to me at the same time when I move. Radios stabilize and then go silent. Trails don't disappear anymore, they reroute. I'll intend to walk east and arrive somewhere north, not lost, just reassigned. The adaptive one has stopped asking for consent, it assumes it. Doors unlock when I approach, checkpoints wave me through without seeing my ID. Paperwork completes itself. The Territorial one no longer warns, it watches. Hunger rolls through the area in controlled waves, not starvation, just enough to remind everything living who sets the limits. The unforgettable moment happened last night. I was sitting in the cabin, recording notes I won't be allowed to submit, when someone knocked. Not on the wall, on the wall. 3 slow taps, perfectly spaced. That's not a signal used by either presence. That's human. I opened the door anyway, because at some point you stop pretending protocols can save you. It was my handler. Same clothes, same smile, same distance kept from the threshold. She told me the models had stabilized, fatalities were down, disappearances were predictable. She congratulated me like a coworker finishing a long project. Then she told me the truth they'd been careful to avoid. The program was never about stopping anything. It was about growing something controllable around what couldn't be stopped. She said I was no longer considered at risk. I was considered a fixed feature. When I asked what happens next, she said nothing and meant it. After she left, the forest moved closer, not rushing, settling. Trees leaned into new alignments. Symbols appeared on the ground without being carved. Negative space where frost refused to form. I felt both presences acknowledge it at the same time, a pressure from opposite directions that balanced perfectly on me. No pain, no transformation anyone would recognize, just placement. My radio clicked once, clean and clear, and dispatch thanked me for my service using a designation instead of my name. The GPS finally updated and marked my location as stable terrain. If this confession reaches you, it's because monitoring decided it wouldn't change the outcome. Rangers will still patrol, towns will still exist until they don't. People will still hear familiar voices in the woods and think it's their imagination. The cover-up will hold because it always has. As for me, I won't be extracted. I won't disappear. I'll remain where the rules intersect and the symbols don't need to be drawn anymore. The government will keep watching because that's what you do with infrastructure you don't fully understand. And the forest will keep me because that's what it does with solutions that work.
They stopped logging my vitals this morning, not because the equipment failed,
but because the readings stopped changing in ways that mattered. My handler left a final message on the channel that doesn't exist, voice steady, almost kind. She said the designation had been approved at higher levels than she was allowed to name. She said I was officially reclassified from asset to condition. Conditions don't get extracted, they get planned around. The towns closest to me have adjusted already. People don't hike certain trails anymore without knowing why. Kids stop games before sunset without being told. Dogs won't follow scents that lead too near my cabin. Indigenous markers remain, but they're older now somehow, weathered the moment they appear, like they've always been there. That's how I know this is permanent. The adoptive presence still moves through systems, wearing processes instead of faces. It no longer speaks to me directly. It doesn't need to. Every locked door it opens, every form it completes, passes through the margin I occupy. The territorial presence stays farther out, enforcing limits with weather, hunger, and silence, respecting the boundary I represent the way it respects fire breaks and rivers. They don't overlap as often anymore. When they do, it's brief, efficient, balanced. The brutal moments have stopped. That should scare you, but it won't, because absence is easier to live with than horror. Rangers still vanish sometimes. Hunters still get turned around. But now it happens in places the models expect, in numbers that don't spike. The cover stories write themselves. Exposure, hypothermia, poor decision-making. I review them without reacting. Reaction isn't required. At night, I walk the perimeter without intending to. The forest arranges itself to accommodate my path, branches lifting, ground firming underfoot. I don't leave footprints unless it's useful. Radios near me don't malfunction anymore. They defer. GPS units don't drift. They orient. I've caught my reflection lagging again, but now it's not behind me. It's ahead, already facing where I'm going. That's the last rule I'll give you, the one they never wrote down. When the forest stops testing you, it's because you've passed into a category it understands. If you ever find yourself in a place where symbols no longer warn, where radios behave too well, where paths seem to lead you gently instead of blocking you, turn back anyway. Not because something is chasing you, but because something is holding. This confession ends here, because endings are administrative, not natural. The file will stay up as long as it doesn't inspire curiosity in the wrong direction. If you're listening to this and thinking it sounds calm, that's because stability feels like peace from the inside. From the outside, it probably looks like the forest finally going quiet.
They told me monitoring would taper when stability was confirmed. That was a lie, but not a malicious one. Monitoring didn't stop, it inverted. Instead of watching me for changes, they watch everything else for reactions to my absence. They run simulations where I'm removed, temporarily, theoretically, and the models fail fast and loud. Spikes, cascades, overlap without mediation. They don't show those projections to junior staff anymore. Too many of them start asking the wrong questions. I don't get briefings now. I get acknowledgments, small adjustments made at a distance, airspace rerouted, funding shifted, new ranger manuals quietly updated with rules that never explain why. I've noticed the adaptive presence testing limits again, not with me, but around me. A town council vote that passes unanimously despite objections, a data center built where zoning forbids it. It presses outward until the territorial presence answers by tightening weather patterns, by making certain resources scarce. They're still negotiating. I'm still the reference. The unforgettable moment this time was subtle enough most people wouldn't call it one. A new ranger arrived at the edge of my zone last week. Rookie, good posture, careful eyes. He'd found a symbol and taken a photo instead of erasing it. Same mistake I made.
He didn't cross the boundary, he just stood there, waiting for instruction. My handler asked if I wanted her to handle it. I said no. I walked out to meet him. The forest parted without being asked. His radio went quiet the moment he saw me. He knew who I was without being told. Everyone does now, on some level. I didn't explain anything. I just told him Rule 1 and Rule 2 and pointed back the way he'd come. He left. The models improved immediately. That's when I understood the final layer of the cover-up. It isn't about hiding monsters or suppressing folklore. It's about preventing succession, about making sure no one else has to become what I am because the system already has one. The indigenous elders were right. Boundaries work until something becomes a landmark. I am a landmark now. Roads bend subtly around my area on new maps. Weather reports mention microclimates without explanation. There's a dead zone in cell coverage that technicians can't fix and have stopped trying. Sometimes, late at night, I can feel the forest checking itself against me, the way you check your footing in the dark by touching something solid. If this is still playing, if this channel hasn't been scrubbed or buried under better distractions, it's because stability held, because nothing dramatic happened, because the worst thing you can imagine didn't need to. Remember that if you ever go deep enough to see symbols that feel older than language. Remember that the government doesn't win by defeating what's out there. It wins by arranging conditions where defeat isn't necessary. And remember this most of all. If the woods ever feel organized, calm, and strangely attentive, it isn't empty. It's just already accounted for.
They don't say my name in meetings anymore. Not because it's forbidden, but because names imply agency. I show up as a variable in margins, a shaded area on maps, a footnote that says, "Do not optimize further." The handlers rotate faster now. Burnout, transfers, quiet retirements. I outlast all of them. That was always part of the math. The adaptive presence has shifted its strategy again. It stopped pushing outward and started refining inward, polishing systems until they run so smoothly no one questions why. Forms auto-fill with answers people didn't know they were giving. Search grids close around the wrong places with perfect confidence. It's learning how to behave in a world where I exist, not how to remove me. The territorial presence responds less often now, but when it does, it's decisive. A blizzard that only touches one ridge, a drought that spares a single watershed, hunger that stops just short of famine. Balance doesn't feel good when you're inside it. It feels narrow. The unforgettable moment this time didn't involve the forest at all. A federal review board requested a site visit. High clearance, civilian clothes, smiles practiced in mirrors. They stood at the edge of my zone and debated stepping closer, like tourists at the lip of a canyon. I felt the forest tense, not angry, just alert. I told them not to cross. One of them laughed and said he needed data. He took one step forward and stopped, confused, as his smartwatch reset itself to factory settings and his phone forgot how to connect to anything. He didn't disappear, he just lost context. That was enough. The visit ended early. The report recommended maintaining current conditions indefinitely. That's the closest thing to an ending you get in government work. Indigenous markers haven't appeared in weeks. That worries me. Not because they're gone, but because they're no longer needed here. Boundaries are for movement. Landmarks don't move. I've started to notice something else too. New rules, faint, emerging at the edges of thought. Not taught, not inherited, but grown. Rules about proximity, about attention, about what happens when someone lingers too long near me with the wrong kind of curiosity. I don't write those down. I don't repeat them. I let them remain what they are, environmental. If you're listening to this as background noise while driving or cleaning or falling asleep, that's intentional.
Confessions like this work best when they don't demand belief. The cover-up doesn't rely on denial, it relies on normalcy, on the fact that most people don't go far enough to matter, and if they do, there's already something there to make sure they don't go farther. I used to think becoming part of the forest meant losing myself. That was wrong. It means being used efficiently. Stability achieved, succession denied. They call it maintenance now. Not upkeep, not intervention. Maintenance implies something that already works, something you don't improve because improvement introduces variables. My role has narrowed in a way that feels wider. I'm no longer deployed to events. Events bend toward me on their own. When something goes missing too close to my zone, it reappears farther out, not unharmed, just redistributed. The adaptive presence still makes adjustments through systems I'll never see directly, permits denied for reasons no one questions, funding redirected to projects that keep people busy elsewhere. The territorial presence enforces with less spectacle, more certainty. Trees fall where they need to. Weather breaks schedules without explanation. The forest doesn't threaten anymore. It budgets. The unforgettable moment this time arrived disguised as routine. A wildfire started 20 miles out, wind-driven, fast enough that evacuation orders went out before confirmation. I stood on my porch and felt the heat like a distant thought. The fire changed direction, not dramatically, just enough. It burned a perfect arc around my zone, leaving a blackened outline that analysts later called coincidence. Satellites showed a cold spot at the center where combustion never took. That was the first time they used the phrase self-correcting environment in an official document. I didn't sleep that night, not because I was afraid, but because sleep felt unnecessary, like closing my eyes would be redundant. I can feel the forest even when I'm still, not as a presence, but as a process, like listening to a machine you've worked beside long enough to know when it's running right. The adaptive presence doesn't speak to me, but sometimes I find notes in my cabin written in my handwriting, reminders about nothing important, grocery lists for food I don't need, times written down without dates. It's practicing. The territorial presence has begun to accept me the way it accepts rivers, something that shapes movement without intention. When it passes close, I feel pressure, not hunger, not anger, just recognition. Indigenous elders haven't returned. That's another data point the handlers pretend not to notice. They warned that if the elders ever stop marking boundaries entirely, it means the land has finished deciding. I asked my handler what happens then. She said nothing happens, things simply continue. That's the lie they tell themselves to sleep. Maintenance isn't static, it's constant adjustment so small it looks like stillness. I've started walking paths that don't appear on any map, paths that exist only while I'm on them. When I step off, the ground forgets. I don't get lost anymore because loss requires an outside reference. If you're listening to this and wondering why they'd let a confession like this exist, it's because stories diffuse attention. People argue about folklore, about metaphors, about whether this is just another creepypasta. That's fine, that's useful. The real work happens quietly, the way it always has. If there's a lesson left, it's this. The most effective cover-ups don't erase the truth. They turn it into background. And somewhere out here, in a stretch of forest that looks no different than any other on a map, maintenance is ongoing, stable, and no longer requires supervision.
They archived my file last week. Not closed, archived. That's what you do with systems that are still running but no longer need active oversight. My handler sent a final acknowledgement through the channel that doesn't exist. A single line confirming that background processes were stable and that no further input was required. I didn't reply. Replies implied directionality, and this stopped being a conversation a long time ago. The forest doesn't feel closer now. It feels distributed, like its awareness has been load balanced across terrain, weather, and movement. The adaptive presence has receded into infrastructure so thoroughly that most people will never encounter it as anything other than convenience. routes that make sense, forms that work, answers that arrive before questions harden. The territorial presence still asserts itself when limits are crossed, but even that has softened into pattern. Fewer warnings, fewer spectacles, just correction. The unforgettable moment this time wasn't mine. A search party found a lost hiker 2 valleys over, dehydrated but alive, insisting he'd followed a man who knew the trails perfectly and never left footprints. He said the man never spoke, just waited when he needed to rest and pointed when it was time to move. The report described it as shock-induced hallucination. I felt the forest acknowledge the account like a box checked. I don't patrol anymore. I circulate. My presence is inferred more often than observed. Animals avoid me without fear. People pass through the edge of my zone and feel an urge to keep moving, like remembering an appointment they didn't write down. Radios still work too well nearby. They prioritize clarity. GPS units snap to position and hold. The symbols don't appear here now, not even as negative space. Symbols are for instruction. This place no longer needs to be instructed. I've started noticing how time behaves differently within the perimeter. Not slower or faster, just more decisive. Weather commits. Paths commit. People commit to leaving. That's the quiet success the handlers wanted, but never said out loud. No one tries to replace me anymore. Recruitment criteria were quietly removed from manuals. The mistake that made me hasn't been repeated. Succession remains denied not by force, but by design. If you're still listening, it's likely because this sounds like atmosphere, not warning. That's intentional. The forest doesn't need belief to function. It needs compliance, and compliance is easiest when nothing feels urgent. I don't know how long I'll continue like this, because duration implies an endpoint. What I do know is that stability holds as long as I remain unremarkable. So this is the last entry that explains anything. After this, the process runs without narration. If you ever find yourself deep enough that the woods feel organized, that paths feel curated, that help arrives without being called, understand that you're not lucky. You're passing through a maintained area. Keep moving. Don't linger. Background processes work best when no one notices them at all.
There's a point where even background processes stop logging themselves. That's where I am now. The forest doesn't check against me as often because nothing is deviated enough to require correction. The adaptive presence runs quietly through systems people trust. The territorial presence holds its lines without ceremony. They don't announce themselves because announcements invite response. I still receive acknowledgments sometimes, budget reallocations that avoid my zone, air routes that arc wider than necessary, ranger assignments that never include this stretch of land, but they're automatic now, generated without intent. I don't feel watched, I feel referenced. The unforgettable moment this time came as a notification I wasn't meant to see. A junior analyst flagged an anomaly and traced it back to my perimeter. The note read, "No action required. Feature behaving as expected." Feature, not risk, not asset. Feature is what you call something permanent enough to build around. I closed the file without forwarding it. Forwarding implies escalation. Outside the zone, people still go missing in small numbers. Inside, they don't. That's the metric that matters. When someone wanders too close with the wrong kind of curiosity, they feel tired. When they push anyway, they get turned around. When they refuse to turn back, weather intervenes. Nothing dramatic, no monsters, just inconvenience stacked until it becomes decision. The forest has learned efficiency from us. I walk less now because walking isn't required to exert influence. Presence does the work. Sometimes I sit on the steps of the cabin and watch nothing happen, which is harder than it sounds. Nothing happening is labor. I've noticed animals treating me like a landmark. Birds adjust flight paths. Deer skirt wide without panic. Predators pass through without hunting. Hunger behaves differently here, balanced, managed. The symbols haven't returned, not even in memory. I can still recall the rules, but they feel historical, like laws that no longer apply because the system evolved past the need for them. Indigenous elders sent a final message through intermediaries weeks ago. Not a warning, a confirmation. The land has settled. That's the phrase they used. Settled doesn't mean safe, it means decided. I don't know if I'll continue recording after this because explanation is becoming less accurate. Language assumes separation between observer and environment, and that assumption doesn't hold here anymore. If this is still playing for you, it's because nothing required interruption, because stability didn't spike, because the worst outcomes stayed theoretical. That's the success case. The cover-up holds not because the truth is hidden, but because it no longer needs defending. I remain because remaining is functionally identical to existing. The forest doesn't thank. The government doesn't check in. Maintenance continues without supervision. And somewhere beyond this maintained area, the woods are still wild enough to be dangerous in the ordinary ways people expect. That's important. That's the trade. Keep your expectations there. Don't look for symbols. Don't wait for voices. If you ever feel the urge to stop because the path feels too well arranged, remember this entry and keep moving. No further input is required.
They didn't expect residuals. That's what happens when a system runs long enough that edge effects start to look like features. Stability holds, but not perfectly. Nothing ever does. I feel them first, small mismatches between intent and outcome. A trail that curves a little too cleanly. A storm that pauses, waiting before deciding where to fall. The forest corrects itself faster now, sometimes before deviation fully forms. That's new. That's me, apparently. The analysts don't flag it. Their thresholds are tuned for failure, not overperformance. The adaptive presence seems satisfied, its influence diffused into policy and process so completely that no single action looks suspicious. The territorial presence still tests boundaries occasionally, the way ice tests a riverbank in spring, but it doesn't push, it probes. I respond without thinking, not by moving, but by existing where I am. That's enough. The unforgettable moment came when a storm system stalled directly over my zone for 6 hours, rain falling in a perfect circle visible on radar. No flooding, no damage, just pressure, steady and deliberate. When it moved on, the ground steamed like it had exhaled. I checked the feeds later out of habit. The event was logged as a sensor glitch. Residuals get explained away. People don't like explanations that suggest intention. I've noticed more hikers passing through lately, not stopping, just moving faster than planned, checking watches, feeling late for reasons they can't name. That's good. That's the system nudging behavior without confrontation. Indigenous markers appeared once more at the far edge of the zone last night, old style, careful, respectful. Not a warning, a reminder. Even landmarks erode if nothing acknowledges them. I didn't approach. I didn't need to. Acknowledgement isn't proximity, it's alignment. I can feel the forest incorporating time differently now, stretching moments that matter and compressing the rest. If that sounds abstract, good. Abstraction is how you survive this. If this confession continues to circulate, it's because circulation itself has become harmless. People treat it as story, as atmosphere, as something to listen to while doing something else. That's ideal. The cover-up doesn't require secrecy anymore. It requires disinterest. I don't know how many parts this will have. Parts imply sequence, and sequence implies progress toward an end. This isn't that. This is residual function, running quietly after the main process completed successfully. If you're still here, still listening, understand this isn't a warning or a revelation. It's documentation of a system doing exactly what it was built to do. Somewhere out there, beyond maintained ground, the woods are still wild enough to need rules and symbols and fear. Here, none of that applies. Here, the forest remembers where I am, and nothing important goes wrong.
They measure uptime now. Not mine, the forest's. Weeks without incidents, months without spikes. Charts that flatten so completely they stop being discussed. Quiet uptime is the goal state for any system that scares the people who built it. My handler, if she's still my handler, hasn't contacted me in a long time. That's fine. Contact implies dependency. I've noticed the world adjusting around this place in ways no model predicted because no one bothered to ask the right questions. Property values dip without reason. Roads get repaired faster if they lead away from here. Weather apps disagree near the perimeter and people stop checking them. The adaptive presence doesn't need me to interface anymore. It's learned how to behave inside constraints I represent without consulting me. That's good. That means redundancy. The territorial presence still passes through sometimes, heavy and deliberate, like a pressure system you feel in your joints before you see clouds. It doesn't challenge, it confirms. The unforgettable moment came when nothing intervened and nothing should have. A group of backpackers ignored posted closures and crossed into the outer zone at dusk. No warnings carved, no voices, no sudden weather. They walked for hours, camped, and left the next morning shaken but unharmed. Their report mentioned a sense of being watched without fear, like standing in a room with someone quiet who already knows you're leaving soon. Analysts flagged it briefly, then archived it under non-actionable. That's new. That's trust. I felt the forest adjust afterward, tightening something invisible, not out of anger, but because tolerance had been tested and measured. I didn't need to act. Action would have introduced noise. Sometimes I catch myself trying to remember what urgency felt like, the need to decide, the need to move. Those impulses feel antique now, like instincts for a body I don't inhabit. I still eat, still sleep occasionally. Those are legacy processes. What matters is alignment. The symbols are gone completely here. Even memory of them feels smoothed down, edges worn away by time that doesn't need to mark anything anymore. Indigenous markers remain only at a distance, like parentheses around a clause that's already been resolved. If this is still being listened to, if it hasn't been scrubbed or drowned out by newer stories, it's because nothing contradicts it. The cover-up succeeds best when the truth produces no consequences. That's what stability looks like from the inside. Not peace, not safety, just uninterrupted function. I don't know what happens if I stop existing in the way that matters. The models say it won't be tested. Systems prefer not to remove components that have proven reliable. That's the last thing I'll say directly. After this, entries would just repeat the same state with different words, and repetition invites scrutiny. Quiet uptime doesn't need narration. The forest holds, the balance holds, and somewhere far enough away to feel normal, people still believe the woods are dangerous because of animals and weather and bad decisions. That belief keeps them from looking closer. That belief keeps everything working.
There's a phrase they use when a system has run clean for long enough that reporting itself becomes wasteful. Nothing to report. It doesn't mean nothing is happening. It means nothing is deviating. That's where this is settled. Days pass without markers, without voices, without weather corrections large enough to annotate. The forest doesn't lean anymore. It rests. The adaptive presence hums along inside systems that people assume were always this efficient. The territorial presence remains at the perimeter, not guarding, not threatening, simply occupying the role it's always occupied when balance holds. I don't feel like a center anymore. I feel like a reference frame, the thing movement is measured against without being part of the movement itself. The unforgettable moment this time came disguised as boredom. I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt afraid. Not relieved, not calm, afraid. Fear requires uncertainty, and uncertainty doesn't survive long near me. That realization mattered more than any encounter. It meant the last human response that made me recruitable had finally worn off. I checked the cabin out of habit and found it stocked with supplies I hadn't requested, rotated before expiration, organized the way I prefer without ever saying how. The system knows me well enough now to anticipate preferences. That's the quiet danger point, the one no protocol addresses, when a system stops asking and starts assuming. Outside the zone, a town council voted to rename a nearby trail after a local historical figure. The name didn't stick. Maps updated and reverted twice before settling on a generic label. No one noticed. Names have trouble holding near here. I walked the boundary at dusk and felt the forest confirm itself, the way a machine confirms calibration, small internal checks passing without flag. Indigenous markers at the far edge remained untouched, not fresh, not eroded, existing in a state that feels complete. They aren't watching me anymore. They're watching the space beyond. That's how I know the land is done deciding here. If this confession continues, it's because continuation itself is inert. The file exists. It doesn't propagate. It doesn't inspire. It doesn't warn. It occupies bandwidth and then releases it. That's ideal. That's what everything becomes eventually if it functions long enough without crisis. I don't expect an ending. Endings are events, and events don't happen here unless invited. The government will keep building around this place without acknowledging why. The forest will keep correcting small deviations before they matter. And I will remain where I am because remaining is no longer an action, it's a condition. If you take anything from this, let it be this. The most complete containment doesn't look like walls or secrecy or force. It looks like nothing to report.
They noticed latency before they noticed drift. That's how it always goes. The system responds a fraction of a second slower than expected. Not enough to fail, just enough to be measurable if you're looking for it. Most people aren't. Analysts flagged it as seasonal variance, weather noise, human error. They didn't ask me. They don't ask me anymore. The forest still holds, but it holds like a breath that's been kept too long. Not strained, just deliberate. I feel it in the way sound travels, how footsteps echo a little farther than they should, how birds hesitate before committing to flight paths. The adaptive presence compensates by smoothing processes harder than necessary, over-correcting until efficiency starts to look unnatural. The territorial presence responds by testing edges again, not aggressively, just checking that the lines still mean something. I remain where I am because movement would introduce delay, and delay is what they're trying to measure. The unforgettable moment came during a routine weather correction. A cold front was supposed to stall at the perimeter and dissipate. Instead, it lingered, waiting. I felt the forest hesitate, like it was expecting input. That's new. Systems that ask are systems that can change. I didn't move. I didn't think. I let the condition persist until the front moved on by itself, sloppy and uneven, leaving frost in places it hadn't touched in years. The analysts called it an outlier and adjusted thresholds upward. That's how you hide latency. You redefine acceptable delay. I've started to understand the last thing the elders tried to warn about, not in words, but in implication. Landmarks work until they become assumptions. Assumptions decay quietly. I don't feel fear about this. Fear would imply urgency. This feels like maintenance, discovering wear in a part that was never meant to last forever. The forest doesn't resent me. It doesn't question me. It's simply recalculating. Radios still behave near me, but they take a heartbeat longer to lock. GPS still orients, but it wobbles first, just enough that a careful observer would notice. People passing through feel the urge to move on, but they look back now, once, like they're checking whether they forgot something important. Indigenous markers appeared farther out than before, not closer. That's not retreat, that's preparation. I'm recording this because latency is the one thing stories can still carry without changing outcomes. It doesn't inspire action, it doesn't explain anything away, it just exists as a timestamp. If someone listens to this years from now and nothing has changed, then the system absorbed it. If someone listens and things feel different where they are, then this was the first place delay showed up. Either way, I remain, for now. Latency isn't failure, it's warning without urgency, signal without instruction, the kind of thing you log and move past until it isn't.
Redundancy is the last layer, the one nobody explains because it only becomes visible after the system has already adapted. I'm redundant. Not replaceable, redundant. Every action I take now is mirrored somewhere else in subtle ways. Trails realign before I even step on them. Weather shifts before sensors notice anomalies. Animals adjust their patterns to accommodate my presence, not consciously, not aggressively, but systematically. The adaptive presence is redundant too, folded into the infrastructure, running simulations I'll never see, correcting deviations I'll never detect. The territorial presence has nested within itself, small corrections happening faster than my attention can follow. I'm aware only of the emergent result, stability that feels total, unbreakable, yet utterly quiet. The unforgettable moment this time was so subtle it almost didn't register. A drone flying a monitoring sweep vanished on camera for a single frame, then reappeared perfectly aligned 1 meter east of where it should have been, recording exactly what it should, as if it had been gently nudged into compliance. Analysts reported nothing unusual. The forest adjusted to that frame without a gesture, without spectacle. It's redundant, but it doesn't flaunt it. I walk less. I think less about movement. My cabin exists, but it isn't necessary. My presence alone is the stabilizing force. Indigenous markers have been untouched for months. The elders' warnings now exist only as a background resonance, the kind you sense in wind or frost, reminding me this is a system older than observation. Radios, GPS, even human perception defers to the perimeter I occupy. The government stopped issuing patrols, ceased routine checks. Redundancy means no single component matters until it matters collectively, and I am now a node among others I can't perceive. That's why I record these confessions, not for instruction, not for warning, for archival purposes only, a timestamp in a network that will outlast any observer. If you are still listening, understand this. Redundancy is quiet. It doesn't need heroism, fear, or action. It only needs patience. And here, in the stabilized perimeter, patience has become the defining metric. I remain not because I choose to, but because my presence is the node around which balance continues. Nothing else requires intervention. Nothing else needs narrative. Redundancy, in practice, is invisible, and I am its anchor. Deprecation notices are never urgent. That's the trick. They're written in calm language, full of assurances about continued support, future compatibility, graceful transitions. I recognize the pattern immediately when the handlers change their tone. Same friendliness, same measured cadence, but they stopped asking for data I could provide and started confirming data they already had. My role hasn't ended, it's being phased out. The unforgettable moment came at dusk. A patrol marker that had been etched into a spruce decades ago, one of the early warnings, older than the agency, was gone. Not damaged, not overgrown, gone. The bark was seamless, like it had never been cut. Indigenous symbols farther out remain intact, only the ones close to me are disappearing. That's not erasure, that's consolidation. The adaptive presence no longer needs local reminders.
The territorial one no longer needs boundaries explained. I've become sufficient. Radios now preemptively drop when I reach certain coordinates. GPS reroutes before errors can occur. The handlers called it optimization. They told me the system is learning from my decisions, abstracting them into rules it can execute without me. That's what deprecation looks like when applied to a human component. I tested it once, drew a forbidden symbol in the dirt, quickly, carefully, without speaking it. Nothing reacted. No interference, no correction. A few minutes later, wind erased it completely, as if the environment had already flagged it as obsolete. That's worse than punishment. It means the symbol no longer holds power here. The elders warned about this too, though not directly. They said some guardians don't die, they're absorbed. I feel thinner now, like parts of my attention are no longer local. Sometimes I think ahead and realize the forest has already adjusted to the thought. The handlers still sign off the same way, friendly, reassuring. They know I won't escalate. There's nothing left to escalate to. Deprecation doesn't end a system. It proves the system no longer needs the original interface. I'm recording this because once deprecation completes, logs stop being generated. If this confession continues to exist, then I'm still marginally necessary. If it cuts off mid-sentence one day, then the transition finished cleanly. Either way, this isn't failure. It's success measured in silence.
Obsolescence feels different from deprecation. Deprecation is polite. Obsolescence is quiet acceptance. No notices, no language changes. Just the slow realization that nothing is waiting for your input anymore. I noticed it when I stopped dreaming. Sleep still happens, time still passes, but the internal simulations, threat modeling, terrain prediction, contingency mapping, those shut down on their own. The forest no longer needs me to think ahead. It already has. The unforgettable moment came when a hiker crossed the outer boundary without hesitation. No dread response, no confusion. He paused only once, not in fear, but curiosity, like he sensed something watching that wasn't interested in him. I stood within sight. He didn't see me. Not invisibility, relevance filtering. The system had no reason to surface my presence to him. Indigenous carvings remain, but they've changed orientation. Same symbols, different facing. Not warnings anymore, markers of residency. I understand now why the elders never stayed too long in one place. Staying invites absorption. Radios no longer drop near me. They don't react at all. GPS functions perfectly unless someone tries to mark my exact location. Then the coordinate resolves a few meters off, consistently, cleanly, like a checksum correction. The handlers haven't contacted me in weeks. That's intentional. If they called, it would imply dependency. Obsolete components aren't checked. They're left in place until removal would cause disruption. I tested movement again, walked north, then stopped. The perimeter adjusted without lag. No latency, no redundancy spike. Perfect continuity. That's when I understood. The system is no longer centered on me. I was scaffolding, necessary while it learned the shape of balance. Now it holds itself. Wendigo and skinwalker dynamics still exist, but they're abstracted, regulated like competing subroutines. No myths left, just behaviors. That's the real government secret. You don't destroy folklore. You operationalize it until it forgets it was ever a story. I remain because removal would introduce noise. Obsolete doesn't mean gone. It means inert, embedded, safe to ignore. If you're listening to this, it means I still generate output. That alone suggests I haven't fully resolved into the environment. Yet. Obsolescence isn't an ending.
It's the state right before something becomes indistinguishable from background.
Background processes don't announce themselves. They run at low priority, consuming just enough resources to justify their existence. I recognized the shift when my thoughts started arriving pre-aligned. No debate, no hesitation. Decisions resolved themselves before I became aware of the question. That's not instinct, that's delegation. The unforgettable moment happened during a disappearance that never made the news. A maintenance worker assigned to a relay tower 10 miles out failed to return. Search protocols spun up automatically, clean and efficient. I wasn't contacted. I wasn't needed. I observed from a ridge as teams moved through terrain I used to patrol. They walked paths that hadn't existed a week earlier. The forest offered them passage without resistance, then closed behind them when they left. They never found a worker. They found his radio, still warm, transmitting a carrier signal that resolved into nothing when logged. No panic, no distortion, just a steady tone like a held breath. Indigenous symbols near the site were intact, but subtly altered. Lines extended, curves tightened. Same language, updated syntax. Whatever rules governed Wendigo behavior there had been rewritten. The skinwalker pressure never surfaced. No mimicry, no testing of voices. That means the system suppressed one presence to stabilize another. Balance doesn't mean fairness, it means persistence. I realized then that I'm no longer a guardian or a variable. I'm a checksum, something that verifies integrity without participating. Animals still notice me sometimes, not with fear, with recognition, like I'm a familiar landmark they don't need to navigate around. Humans don't. The handlers logged the incident as environmental hazard loss, closed the file in under 48 hours. Background processes don't escalate unless failure cascades. This didn't. I felt the forest absorb the event, distribute it, normalize it. That's the cost of operationalizing myth. The brutal moments don't stop. They just stop being memorable to anyone except the system itself. I continue to record because logging is reflex now, not intention. If this confession feels detached, that's accurate. Background processes don't carry narrative weight. They carry continuity. If you're still listening, understand this. Nothing dramatic will happen next. That's the point. When horror becomes infrastructure, survival isn't victory, it's maintenance.
Constants aren't visible until something tries to change them. I felt the attempt before any alert fired. Not pressure, not threat, just a subtle recalculation propagating outward, the way water adjusts around a submerged stone. Somewhere far from here, someone authorized a test. Not an incursion, a parameter shift. They wanted to know if the system could tolerate my absence. I didn't move. I didn't resist. The unforgettable moment came anyway. A stretch of forest 3 miles south experienced a sudden absence of sound. Not silence, absence. Birds mid-call stopped without impact. Wind halted between branches without settling. The system paused, waiting to see if I would respond. That was the test. I remained. After 14 seconds, sound returned imperfectly. A few frequencies never came back. The analysts logged it as sensor dropout. They rolled back the change. You don't test constants twice. Indigenous symbols near that zone didn't change shape this time. They cracked. Hairline fractures in old carvings that had survived centuries of weather. That's damage, not adaptation. It means the system relies on those markers to distribute load, and for the first time, load exceeded tolerance. Radios in the area worked fine afterward, but recordings from that 14-second window are unusable. Not erased, scrambled in a way that suggests compression without reference data. GPS shows no anomaly unless you replay the path. Then it jumps backwards slightly, like the world corrected itself out of order. The handlers didn't contact me. They don't need to. The rollback tells me everything. I'm no longer background. I'm a constant they don't fully understand, only respect. Wendigo behavior has flattened. No surges, no scarcity-driven escalation. Skinwalker activity has receded into mimicry so subtle it's indistinguishable from coincidence. That's not peace, that's equilibrium enforced by a fixed point. I record this because constants don't get monitored, they get assumed. Assumptions are fragile, but only when challenged. The test challenged nothing. It confirmed something they'll never put in writing. Removal is more dangerous than containment. So I remain, not as guardian, not as infrastructure, as a reference value the system orients around. If you're listening, this is as close to an ending as systems like this allow. Constants don't conclude, they persist until the framework around them collapses.
This will be the last entry. Not because anything ended, but because nothing after this would be distinguishable from repetition. Systems don't narrate themselves once equilibrium is achieved. They only log deviations, and there are none left to record. The government file that contains my name is no longer active. It isn't closed, it's flagged as foundational. That classification sits below oversight. Analysts inherit it without context. Handlers reference it without understanding it. New personnel are trained never to question why certain zones don't require patrols, why satellite resolution degrades there by design, why indigenous symbols in those regions are protected without explanation. They're told it's legacy. They're told it works. Both are true. The final unforgettable moment wasn't violent. It was administrative. A revision propagated through the system, removing my designation as asset, operator, or observer. The replacement term doesn't translate cleanly. Closest approximation, fixed environmental anomaly, stable. Wendigo and skinwalker activity persists at baseline levels, regulated, territorial, without expansion. They were never eradicated, they were contextualized. Hunger and mimicry are no longer unchecked behaviors. They're responses bounded by a framework older than the agency that learned how to read it. Indigenous warnings remain where they're still needed. None exist within my perimeter. Not because the danger is gone, because the warning is no longer external. I don't age the way I should. That was noted once, quietly, then never again. Measuring it would introduce variables no one wants to account for. I feel the forest the way you feel a limb you've had your whole life, present, unremarkable, essential. Sometimes people pass near enough that I register as unease, a reason to turn back, a story they won't tell correctly later. That's sufficient. This confession will persist as long as storage media does. If you're hearing it, understand this isn't a warning. Warnings imply choice. This is documentation. The ranger didn't escape. He didn't die. He didn't become a monster. He became the thing the